Now, where did you come up with the name, The Sundays?
In the sitting room, I think. That's where we came up with it.
Might have been somewhere like that. We had a gig the next day, and it's the old story of wants to find a name quickly, and that was the only one that we could all even remotely agree on, I think.
The Sundays shared some similarities with the band Mazzy Star. While the Sundays were British and Mazzy Star were American, both groups would be fronted by women, and the attention of the bands mostly rested on the vocalist and guitarist. Mazzy Star and the Sundays would take long hiatuses and were also known for being press shy. After only a handful of shows, the Sundays were getting splashed on the front covers of the British weeklies and were being heralded as the next big thing. They weren't part of any particular scene, and literally they came out of nowhere. But then they suddenly disappeared. It seemed ironic that frontwoman Harriet Wheeler and guitarist David Gavurin's favorite movie was Stranger Than Paradise, a perfect metaphor because there's long stretches where nothing happens. Today, let's take a look at whatever happened to the Sundays. The history of the Sundays begins with guitarist and founding member David Gavurin, who is the son of an accountant. He grew up in Wembley and started playing guitar in high school, telling Florida Today, "I was part of the adolescent post-punk anyone in high school can be in a band phenomenon." His high school bands ultimately went nowhere, and he soon stopped playing the instrument when he started attending Bristol University to study both French and Spanish in the mid-80s. It was while attending university he would meet his better half, a woman named Harriet Wheeler, who was the daughter of an architect and teacher who was studying English literature. Harriet, who was from Reading, would be introduced to David through mutual friends, and they soon started dating. Wheeler would tell Billboard, "I'm sure we annoyed our neighbors, sitting on garden walls, talking about all the absurd things you talk about when you're in your 20s and drinking too much and smoking an inordinate amount of roll-ups." Wheeler had gone through a similar phase like Gavurin, playing in high school bands, and one of her earliest influences was the Jackson 5, whom she tried to sing along to, thinking that at one point she was Michael Jackson. It was towards the tail end of their time at Bristol that Gavurin once again picked up the guitar, and the idea was simply to create music and to kill time. He also thought that maybe down the road he could become a working musician so he wouldn't have to deal with the mundane realities of an office job. But rock superstardom or a record deal was really the furthest thing from his mind. He would tell the American press, "We were unsure of ourselves in the beginning of whether we really had something. That's maybe why people who work with us call us perfectionists." The pair soon invested in a drum machine, a bass guitar, and a 4-track recorder, and began writing and recording songs. Next, they turned their attention to playing live shows, but they needed to find 2 musicians to replicate the recordings. Gavurin would recall, "We picked friends of ours. We weren't really looking for people to contribute musically. We didn't want to put ads in music papers saying we wanted anybody to play with us." They would enlist fellow Bristol students, a bassist named Paul Brindley, and drummer Patrick "Patch" Hannon. The Sundays' music was both dreamy and ethereal, and by their own admission, full of unusual rhythms. Gavurin would tell Florida Today, "We set out to write songs that don't feel like every other song you've ever heard. They aren't completely conventional. We tend to follow slightly unusual rhythms." As for the lyrics, Gavurin would add, "I'll put down a lyric and Harriet will write the next line. I admit it's kind of weird, since I don't know many other writers who work that way, but it works for us. We like that a person can be writing a song one way and the other person can take it in a completely different tangent." The Sundays' lyrics didn't particularly tell one single story, as the group would claim. Instead, the band's songs feature a jumble of emotions and words, mixed with, as Gavurin once put it, completely meaningless garbage. The Sundays would cite Cocteau Twins, Joni Mitchell, John Martin, and Indian folk pop singer Najma as their primary influences. But the press, in addition to comparing them to Cocteau Twins, frequently liked to lump them in with 10,000 Maniacs, The Smiths, New Order, and the Jesus and Mary Chain. The quartet soon moved to London, and it was here that they cut their demo tape to really introduce themselves to club owners to land some gigs. Gavurin would admit to MTV that club owners were sent so many tapes that they generally didn't even listen to them, but the Sundays would catch their lucky break. One club owner listened to their tape and booked the band. They soon played their first show only 8 weeks after assembling in August of 1988 at the Vertigo Club, opening for the group Caretaker Race. At that gig, the Sundays were one of 3 openers that night, and unbeknownst to the band in attendance were 3 members of the British press. They were there to review the headliner, but instead the writers would walk away mesmerized by the Sunday set. The following day, reviews of the Sunday's performance would garner positive write-ups in the weekly music mags. It was following their second gig, the Sundays appeared on the front cover of New Musical Express, and at the same gig, executives from record labels showed up. By the Sundays' 4th gig at a North London pub, A&R people almost came to blows over who could sign the band. To the British press, the Sundays seemed to come out of nowhere, and unlike so many groups that came out of a scene, the Sundays formed in a bit of a vacuum. They hadn't played any gigs in Bristol, they were already receiving a ton of attention after only a handful of gigs, and within weeks of that first gig in August of '88, Harriet and David were being inundated with phone calls from labels, managers, and publishing companies. Gavurin would tell the LA Times in 1990, "We'd done no gigs, contacted no one, sent out no tapes, and suddenly we had record companies courting us and 4 firm offers." The Sundays would opt to sign with indie label Rough Trade, which was also home to the Smiths. The band's first single, titled Can't Be Sure, would be released in 1989 and soon won rave reviews from the British press, who were fawning all over them. Despite all the attention, the Sundays would manage themselves and initially refused to hire a manager, with Gavurin telling the Toronto Star, "We tended to distrust people who were ringing us up. We didn't even know what they wanted a piece of." New Musical Express would put Wheeler and Gavurin on the front cover of their first issue of the decade, calling 1990 the year of the Sundays. Meanwhile, other publications like Melody Maker declared that they had discovered the band a year earlier, with them humbly writing, "Over a year ago, the Maker discovered the Sundays and created the biggest media storm since we first put the Sugar Cubes on the cover." The Sundays were soon dubbed as Britain's new pop hope. The band had no option but to look at the intense press coverage as being humorous. For them, they were just excited to be able to record an album. But the Sundays were also aware that the British press were fickle. The same bands who were being held up as being the next big thing would frequently face a backlash from the British press years later. I do want to point out that not all the press was on board with the band in their early days. The Evening Post from Bristol would slam the band for lacking any kind of variety, writing, "I'm baffled. I've been baffled, perplexed, and ever so slightly annoyed for some time by the Sundays. I really can't understand why they're so popular," with the writer later adding, "The Sundays seem to live in a world of untroubled mediocrity." The writer would go on to claim that the band's recipe of the Smiths, the Cocteau Twins, and the Sugar Cubes, and I quote, "doesn't work." The Sundays would spend 1989 recording their debut record, Reading, Writing, and Arithmetic, with Geffen Records subsidiary DGC distributing the release stateside. The album's lyrics touched on feelings, but went about them in an ironic and humorous way. Unlike so many bands who record dozens of songs for an album, the Sundays didn't really operate that way. Instead, they barely had enough songs for their first release because they spent so much time laboring over the tracks. Released in January of 1990, the Sundays' debut album would slowly move up the alternative and college rock charts in the States. The play on college and alternative radio coupled with word of mouth helped push sales in the States, and the album eventually went gold, selling 500,000 copies, thanks to the success of the single Here's Where the Story Ends, which would top the alternative rock charts, and MTV also picked up on the band, even featuring them on the program 120 Minutes. Side note, if you love 120 Minutes and alternative rock, I've done a whole video on the history of the MTV show, the link is down below. Gavurin would tell the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette how the band succeeded with so much stacked against them, revealing, "The most satisfying thing about our popularity in America is that it doesn't seem to be the result of one big push by either radio or press. Radio has helped hugely, but it seems to be a word-of-mouth thing." The Sundays' debut disc would be hailed as one of the best albums of the year, but Gavurin would later admit to the Arizona Republic that his inexperience in the studio led to him wishing their debut disc was a little harder sounding. He did, however, see the band's live show as a way to redeem how he thought the record should have sounded. As for the fame that came with the band's success, the Sundays would view it through a lens of suspicion. Gavurin would tell the Heights newspaper, "I have a real fear of what that kind of success does to the music. Fame would be more of a hassle than anything else. We don't want to become a big commercial pop band. We're not elitist, and sure, we'd like to be heard by lots of people, but not by being a sellout pop band." The Sundays would take a 2-year break, releasing their follow-up in 1992. A 2-year break is pretty normal for a lot of bands, but strangely enough, some in the press made it seem like the band just disappeared. I will say it didn't seem like the Sundays did a lot of press during 1991 while on tour, and Gavurin would tell The Observer, "We did a long tour abroad and we didn't have any journalists with us because we felt sorry for them sitting on the couch all day." The band, like I said earlier, were managing themselves until only recently when they got a manager in 1992, so of course that took up a lot of time as well. The Sundays would run into some business troubles when they lost the recording contract with Rough Trade after the company declared bankruptcy. The Sundays would be rescued though by Parlophone Records in the UK, while Geffen still distributed them stateside. As for that 2-year gap between albums, Gavurin would explain how the band worked at a snail's pace, adding, "Harriet and I work in separate rooms playing and singing into tapes, copying them and working on them again. Paul Brindley and Pat Shannon come in at the end and add their parts." The band would call their second album Blind, and Wheeler would reveal the meaning behind the title, stating, "To touch on a sense of confusion that there aren't clear answers to how we behave or feel." Their sophomore effort Blind would feature more polish and layers than their debut record, and Geffen had high hopes for the band, throwing a lot of money behind the tour and promotion. Gavurin would tell the Morning Call newspaper, "It seems that even more people are into the band this time around. We're playing places that are about twice the size from last time. We played to about 1,000 people. Feels like we're making progress." The paper would also cite Hollywood actress Winona Ryder as being one of the band's biggest fans. Blind would also feature a cover of the Rolling Stones tune Wild Horses, with Gavurin telling the same paper, "The last time we were in America, we bought the Stones' Sticky Fingers album. We obviously knew the song, but after mucking around with it, we decided to play it and we thought it sounded good. There probably was something mildly perverse about us covering that song. They're not the kind of band that people would expect us to cover." MTV's program 120 Minutes and some alternative and cult stations took a liking to their Stones cover. The Sundays' second record was a strong seller, just like their first, but some critics criticized the band for recycling melodies from their first record and not diversifying their sound enough. Despite some lukewarm reviews, it didn't seem like the band faced a big backlash from the British press. The Sundays would play a sold-out US tour in 1993, but they cut the trek short due to exhaustion and being homesick. During their time off, the Sundays continued to write music. Harriet and David would build a studio in their home in the UK, and they also wanted to learn how to operate the equipment and become more self-sufficient and save money in the process. Then in 1995, the couple welcomed their first child. While being romantically involved with another member of your band has ruined or destroyed a lot of groups, Gavurin would look at it differently, telling the Chicago Tribune, "Being a couple causes more shared enjoyment than discord. Problem at any given moment can be intense. It would be different if it was one of us performing and you had a difficult dead-end job, but we're both enjoying the ups rather than just one of us being up in our career." The Sundays would return in 1997 with their third and final album, Static and Silence. Unlike their first two albums, which had sessions sometimes stretching out over 2 days, Harriet and David took a more relaxed approach, recording in their home studio and ditching the late-night recording sessions. Plus, they were now parents, so they also had to care for someone else. The way the band wrote the songs was also different this time around, with Gavurin telling MTV News, "It used to be the case that we finished the music before we'd even write the melody line on top of it, and last of all, we'd do the lyrics. But on this album, the melodies came up as the initial idea. It felt like a less clinical process. It made for a more direct-sounding album, and since it had been almost half a decade since their last release, there was a seismic shift in the music scene." The band would admit their third record was their most simple, at least lyrically. Despite being their highest charting album of their career in America, commercially it didn't have the legs. The first single, Summertime, would be inspired by David and Harriet's friends who enrolled in a dating service program. In a statement that is eerily relevant today, Gavurin would tell Billboard in 1997, "As society offers fewer and fewer opportunities for people to meet, the idea of going to a dating service or a Lonely Hearts Club and placing single adverts, that has become increasingly respectable, at least in the UK. Wheeler would add, the trend of busy people ordering everything over the phone or computer seems to contribute to that sort of made-to-measure mentality. The Sundays would tour on the album, but they brought along their daughter on the road, and they also had a nanny to help out. Their label Geffen also gave the band a lighter interview workload. After Static and Silence, the couple had their second child and went on an indefinite hiatus, living a normal life and raising their family. It resulted in some thinking the band broke up, and some fans dug deep, okay, maybe a little too deep, to see what the members were up to. In 2019, there was a fascinating piece written by a fan named David Obachowski on longreads.com who chronicled his journey to interview Harriet and David. He exchanged some messages with one of the members who was press shy, and it resulted with him, through the help of a friend, getting the address of Harriet and David in the UK and almost going all the way to their house and ringing their doorbell. Ultimately, though, he decided not to do it. Then out of nowhere, Harriet and David would give their first interview in nearly 17 years in 2014 to Rolling Stone. I'm just joking, they didn't do Rolling Stone. Out of all the publications they spoke to, they broke their long silence to American Airlines in-flight magazine American Way. The interview was conducted through email. So how did American Airlines get the interview? Well, interviewer Adam Pitluck was a huge fan of the Sundays and put in a request through bassist Paul Brindley. Brindley passed on the request to the press-shy couple, who surprisingly agreed to do an interview. Brindley has since become an entrepreneur, and he's the CEO of a company named Music Ally, who, according to Pitchfork, is, and I quote, a London-based company that explores and implements ways in which music and technology can co-evolve. The couple revealed to the magazine that they had never stopped working on new music, and in the interview they would state, and I quote, the contentious bit, unfortunately, is the reunion gig. First, let's see if the music we're currently writing ever sees the light of day, and then we can get on to the enjoyable globetrotting meets concert planning stage. The pair would hint that if they ever were to do a live show again, they'd likely play locales they've never visited, including Aruba, Fiji, and the Galapagos Islands. Patrick Hannon, meanwhile, was the only one of 4 members who continued to play music publicly, performing drums in the band The Audience and becoming a session musician. Then in 2020, Hannon gave an interview providing an update on that new music that the band had been working on. He would be quoted as saying, Harriet and David never stopped making music, and that there are a number of tracks that he's drummed on, but cautioned fans that these recordings may never see the light of day. So let me know, guys, do you think we'll ever hear new music from the Sundays or see them perform again? Who knows, maybe they'll show up at Coachella one of these years. That does it for today's video. Thanks for watching, guys. As always, if you have suggestions for future topics you'd like to see me cover, use the link in the description box below. We'll see you again in Rock and Roll True Stories.
Yeah.
I read that you wanted a name that wasn't larger than the music. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the music's pretty large, and the Sundays is not a very long name, so I think
the music's enormous.
that's it, yeah. No, I mean, there's no sort of particular significance in it. It was just sort of something like fairly neutral for the name, because like the name's sort of like an extra, really. The music for us is sort of, you know, obviously more important, and it seems that there are like some bands that have names that, I don't know, like 10,000 Maniacs or something, that you hear the name and it sort of conjures up something before you've even heard the music. Well, we didn't want that. I mean, I think that's a good name, but it wasn't, you know, what we wanted for us, so.